Over the last 35 years, we've developed 4 models. Because we're selling these models on 6 continents, we're dealing in many different climatic situations. So if we are in a northern climate, we may need to resist a heavy snow load. If I'm in a more tropical place like Florida or parts of India or Australia, now I have to worry about cyclones, typhoons, hurricanes, things like that. And so then we have to have models that can resist high wind loads. Then I've got field crops in dry conditions where there's not a lot of rain, but they need protection from just basically too hot and too dry. And so we've got models that will shed water, collect water to a gutter system, and models that will allow the water to come through. And so from a model point of view, we have a retractable flat roof house, which is the lowest cost house that gives you the ability to regulate plant temperature and water loss. We can protect from the impact of a hard rain, but we cannot keep the rain off the plants. And so that model is more what we would say it's not a retractable greenhouse, it's an automatic retractable field covering system. So if I'm growing papaya or blueberries or things like that where the rain is not a major factor, but I'm trying to manage the temperatures to extend the season and improve the quality, then I would use a simple retractable flat roof. There's then the X-frame model, which is also more of a automatic retractable field covering system, but instead of a flat roof, it's a peaked roof. So it now has the ability to shed water, rainwater to a gutter system. And so now you can keep the plants dry, but you also have the option now to collect all that water to a central reservoir and rain harvest basically. So you're now creating your own water supply of very high quality irrigation water. And so flat roof and X-frame are more for what we would call extensive production, where I want to cover 5, 10, 20 hectares of fields of crops. Then we have the rafter house model and the A-frame model, which are more the workhorses where I have to resist 140, 170, 200 kilometer per hour winds or heavy snow loads. So basically we've got models that are more like field covering systems and then models that are more of a greenhouse structure designed for extreme wind loading or snow loading. Well, the size of the structure is really limited by the ventilation system in any structure. So whether you're talking pad and fan, natural ventilation, or retractable roof. So if we start off with pad and fan, for example, normally your maximum length from gable to gable, say, is 30 meters because that's the maximum the fans can pull without having too much of a temperature differential from the pad end to the fan end. And when you're going into natural ventilation, the bigger the structure is, the hotter it tends to get in the middle, because when you open a vent like this, it's not changing air as effectively as is required, and you can't really drop your humidity levels down sufficiently at certain times of the day. In a retractable roof, instead of the roof moving this way, it actually moves this way. So it's retracting like that. So you can create a 5% opening at 10, 15, 20, 50, whatever the number is, you can create that correct opening. Now, when I create a horizontal opening, hot air naturally wants to rise up, and it actually can rise up unimpeded because there's nothing there to stop it. And when I'm using a retractable cooling roof, in addition, it's actually reducing the amount of heat that's coming into the house. And when I combine a reduced heat entry with a more effective vent, there is really no practical limit on the size of the house. So we've got projects where it's 5 hectares under one roof in hot climates. We've got projects that are 17 hectares under one roof. And so it can be 500 meters from one wall to the next, and you could walk anywhere in that 17 hectares and the climate is the same and the plants are performing the same. And that's really important because most growers focus really intensely on trying to make sure that the irrigation is supplying the same amount of water to every single plant all over the house. But if your climate's not uniform, the plants are not losing the same amount of water throughout the house. And so if I'm giving 100 units of water to every single plant, and this plant is losing 100 units, and this plant is losing 50 units, and this plant is losing 150 units, my plants are not going to be performing the same. And so one of the things we take very seriously when we're doing the design of the retractable roof house is how to make sure that we have uniformity in the climate regardless of the size of the house, so that the plants are losing the same amount of water, and then the irrigation can deliver the same amount of water. Crops in the same structure. That's actually quite easy to do. So the first thing is, are you growing the same types of crops? So are you growing vegetable crops, tomato, pepper, cucumber, which is different than berry crops, strawberry, raspberry, blueberry, blackberry? Because if you're growing a vegetable crop in a warm climate, you probably want to have a layer of insect net below the retractable roof, so that you're actually growing in a net house or screened house environment, and then you have the retractable cooling roof over top in order to regulate the climate underneath. And when you do that, both pepper, tomato, and cucumber all will benefit from growing in a screened environment, and they will all benefit from having a retractable cooling roof over top, and they will all benefit from having rain protection or keeping the dew out of the house at night. There's absolutely no problem growing several crops in the same house. However, just like you would set up your irrigation system so that you're feeding your cucumbers different from your peppers and your cucumbers, the same thing is you would want to have the motor that's controlling the roof over those cucumbers you should be matching the area controlled by the motor with the crop. So as an example, if I had a cucumber crop, I would need to close that roof earlier in the day to protect the plant from high radiation and low humidity, because those big cucumber leaves lose lots of water. And if I'm growing a capsicum, that's the next least sensitive crop, and so I would leave that roof retract a little bit longer, because the capsicum can take more light and lose more water. And then the tomato crop has the greatest tolerance for high transpiration rates, and so as long as you have a motor for each of those crop zones, there's no problem growing all those crops side by side. Some people will put a partition wall from insect net between the cucumbers and the capsicum, simply because if they want to maintain a higher humidity level with the cucumbers, they may be controlling a low pressure misting or fogging system over here for the cucumbers, and they'll have a different setting for the humidity for the capsicum. So the house design doesn't change if I want to do multiple crops, other than I just want to have enough motors to control the retractable roof. What is the normal lifespan of the roof coverings on the retractable roof, and how resistant is it to hail and high wind speeds? So if we first deal with the weather extremes, generally roof coverings on the retractable roof last between 8 to 12 years. Now we do have some customers that are using it for 16 years, but really if you count on 8 to 12, you're in the safe range, and you're not over extending what you're thinking the roof can do. Within those time frames, we have not seen roof coverings damaged by hailstorms, and I'm talking even cricket ball sized hailstorms in Australia, where it broke tempered glass and there was no damage to the retractable roof covering. So hail is really not a concern when it comes to the retractable roof covering. When we first came out with the retractable A-frame house back in 1993, commercially, there was a lot of concern about how would it do in windstorms, and people thought it would blow away. So now here we are, 24 years later, and Cravo retractable roof houses have been hit by 16 hurricanes, cyclones, or typhoons, and including the big ones that hit Puerto Rico last year, Hurricane Maria, I think it was, over 200 km/h winds. And over those 16 hurricanes, we've never lost a roof, we've never lost a structure. And so we do have structures that are designed anywhere from 110 to 200 km/h winds based on the roof being closed. Now, if I have a house that has 110 capacity and I'm going to get 200, simply you retract the roof and roll up the sidewalls and you just let the wind blow through, and you can't lose a house if there's no covering exposed to catch all the wind. And so we're really not concerned about hail or wind, and the insurance companies that insure greenhouses hold Cravo in a very high rating because we have proven that we can design both the roof covering and the structure to resist those kind of winds. When people say, how is it possible that a retractable roof can last 8 to 12 years, whereas a poly roof is 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and it could be damaged by hail, and if it blows off, you start with a little tear, and then all of a sudden, and the roof blows off. So why doesn't a retractable roof do that? The first thing is we're using a reinforced polyethylene covering that has a coating on both sides. And so it's not an extruded film. It actually has a woven base to it that won't stretch and has a very high tensile strength. The second thing is the retractable roof covering is not laying on top of a steel tube. And so in a poly house, the plastic's laying right on top of the tube, and if you've got 45-degree temperatures outside and you got pad and fan cooling or whatever, that arch could be 70 degrees Celsius, and now the plastic's sitting on that hot steel, which will then start to affect the plastic chemically. In a retractable roof, it's never laying on top of steel, so you don't have a heat transfer from a hot steel tube onto the plastic. The third thing is that conventional polyethylene film, when it's laying on top of the plastic, it's going to in a high wind, and that's going to start to create a friction. And because the retractable roof is retracted sometimes, there is no wear and tear, no friction at all when the roof is retracted. So we are reducing the number of hours that the roof covering is exposed to the effects of the wind. So we don't have the heat, we don't have the friction, and we're using a reinforced polyethylene covering that's a lot stronger and not subject to stretching. Because a polyethylene film can stretch over time, and when it stretches it becomes loose, and then it starts to do this, and then eventually it's going to break. So the combination of design differences is what's giving us that longer life. Okay, so yeah, there is a perception in the marketplace out there that Cravo is, a retractable roof is a more expensive system than a conventional poly house. Now, the thing is, when you're looking at retractable roofs, because there's an environmental computer and one motor can close almost 4,500 square meters of peaked roof and 9,000 square meters of flat roof, if I'm doing a small project, we're going to definitely be more expensive because we have that fixed cost of the drive system, the motor, the computer, the weather station covering a small area. But when I can take those costs and I can now cover a 5-hectare project, for example, or a 5-hectare field, all those fixed costs are getting spread out over a larger area. Whereas when you're doing poly houses, for example, if they're pad and fan cooling, and you're limited to 30 meters from pad to fan end, then you've got to create all these separate blocks of houses in order to maintain sufficient cooling. And so there's a lot of money in the perimeter walls of a pad and fan house or a retractable roof. I've got projects that are 230 meters from wall to wall or 500 meters from wall to wall, and so those costs get spread out over more square meters. So the first thing is the cost per square meter on a retractable roof will change dramatically based on the size of the project and whether it has a single layer, a double layer retractable roof, insect net, retractable insect net. So there's a lot of different design options that we can build in that can either increase or decrease the cost. The second thing is that we're not trying to design it to be low cost. We're trying to design it to be a long-lasting asset, because when businessmen and investors are buying facilities, they're looking for long service life without a lot of problems. And so because over the 35 years we've been doing this, we've seen the long-term consequences of different decisions we made 25 years ago, and things we are happy we did or things we're unhappy we did. And so we really have narrowed down what are the specs of how do you get the longest lasting retractable roof design, but still balancing in mind cost. So when it comes to return on investment, there's really two factors that drive your return on investment, and that is what is your revenue per square meter, and then what is your fixed cost of production. And so in countries where electricity is expensive and water is in short supply or it's expensive, a retractable roof will use 1 to 2 kilowatt hours of electricity per day per hectare. And when you're comparing that to a pad and fan, I think the numbers I heard was 800 kilowatt hours of electricity per day per hectare for a pad and fan cooled house. So here you're talking about 2 kilowatt hours versus 800. Now, when you're in countries where electricity is not really dependable, you're going to need a backup power generator. So do you need one for 2 kilowatts or 800 kilowatts? And so in a retractable roof, we frequently don't use a lot of water for cooling. We barely use any electricity. So those costs of growing go down because we're not using all these inputs on a day-to-day basis. But generally, the return on investment is not coming so much from reducing your cost of production. It's more from being able to extend the season and maintain high quality through the changing of the seasons. So if you look at the market here in India, when people built poly houses, and if I ask them, so when did your poly house really perform well? Probably November to March, and then it didn't work as well. Okay, so you're in peak production from November to March, right? Yes. When is open field in production? November to March. I go, what? You're building an expensive facility to compete with open field? Because their cost of production is a lot less than yours in a poly house. So if you're trying to sell your product at the same time as open field, you will never be profitable, because open field is the lowest cost of production. The problem with open field is the season that you can supply is short. So that supply curve does this. And so what retractable is designed to do is not to compete with open field. Is to complement open field. If you can grow an open field from here to here, you should be growing an open field from here to here. But if you need a retractable roof to get here and here, that's what you should be doing. Because the problem is with the poly house, you're in the market at the same time as the field. So the whole system was set up to fail for the farmers because they weren't really able to achieve a higher price per kilo by getting into those shoulder seasons. And so what we do is we start with when are the prices the best, which is when is the climate the most adverse. And how are we going to design a production system that will give you the potential to achieve the maximum yield and quality when the supply is short? And so return on investment is going to be controlled by how many kilos, but more importantly, when are you harvesting? How can we use less electricity? How can we use less water? How can we use less chemicals? And how can we make it more comfortable for the workers to work in? Because if you're in a poly house in April and it's really hot and humid, people don't want to be working inside, and they're not going to be as productive when the climate is really not comfortable. So in the retractable roof, we're trying to create the best environment for the plants, which is pretty close to the ideal environment for people.